Hi, everybody. This is Ronelle Delmont. I'm back again with another book. This is a big one. This could be 3 books, the size of it. It's 700 pages, and it's called The Devil's Chessboard. Alan Dulles, I'll explain who he is if you don't remember his name. Alan Dulles, the CIA, I think you heard of them. The CIA and the Rise of America's Secret Government. The Devil's Chessboard. I have recommended this book so many times, and people, when they pick it up, they don't know what they're getting themselves involved with. It's a book you cannot put down. It's better than any mystery book, any history book of the United States in the last century, because Alan Dulles was born in the late 19th century, the brother of John Foster Dulles. The two men were and would become uh, in our lifetime. I'm assuming that the people listening to me are not 18 and 20 years old. Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster were the two most powerful brothers in the history of the United States. There were only two other brothers that had as much power as them, and those were the Kennedy brothers, John Kennedy and his brother Robert. And in many ways, the Dulles brothers had much more power than the man who would become president and his brother, the attorney general, neither of whom are alive and didn't live long enough to change the world for the better. This is a book by David Talbot. You can see his name here. He's the creator of a website called Salon, a news reporting website, which he created. Now he's written this book after having written a book called The Brothers, which was about Robert and John F. Kennedy. This book is called The Devil's Chessboard because it's about two different brothers who played chess throughout their lives, using the world as their private chessboard. As I said, there were no two brothers more powerful than Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA under President Eisenhower, and his brother John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. So let's go back to World War II, where this book begins. The book begins with stories of Nazis, stories of an organization I think you've heard of called the OSS, Office of Special Services, which was formulated by a guy named Wild Bill Donovan. And there's much in this book about that agency. It was a spying agency from World War II. America doesn't really have a big history in spying the way the Russians or the British have had for centuries. And during World War II, we needed spies, and Allen Dulles. Let me just explain. Allen and John Foster, a few years apart. John Foster was older than Allen. They were born in Watertown, New York, up somewhere near Lake Erie. They were not from an enormously wealthy family, though they were rich. Their father had been a preacher in one of the sects of Protestant Christianity. I don't remember if it was Methodist, Calvinist, I think, but it doesn't matter. They're on their mother's side. These two brothers had an uncle named Robert Lansing, Lansing, and Robert Lansing, their dear uncle, in the late 19th century, of course, in the early 20th century, was the Secretary of State to a president named Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was the president of that country when the end of World War I came about. He would be at Paris, the Treaty of Versailles, and Robert Lansing was there too. By this time, the two brothers, the two nephews of Robert Lansing, were, by that time, they were lawyers. and they were taken to Versailles, where they learned about foreign policy, diplomacy, and something else called imperialism and colonialism. And they're going to learn, like everyone else on the planet, the most shocking thing takes place at the end of World War I. If you never thought about this, it's one of the most important aspects of the 20th century. It happened at the end or during World War I. World War I had not yet been completed when those people over there in the biggest country on earth, 1/6 of all the land on this planet, belonged to the Romanov Empire for 400 years. And during World War I, it's not going to be theirs anymore. People of that empire rise up, they put down their guns on the battlefield, they go home and they have a revolution. As a matter of fact, they're going to have two revolutions, one in February 1917. The war is still raging in Europe at that point. And then later, a few months later, in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks take over. And that's not something that the Western world wants to see, because most of the Western world's empires, like the British, the French, and the United States, they don't want to see communism rule any country on this planet. And they're going to invade the Soviet Union to stop the Bolshevik Revolution, but it fails. And the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, which leads to the founding of the USSR and the Soviet Republic. So this is the youth of two lawyers. These are the earliest days in the lives of these two lawyers, Allen Dulles, who this book is about. The book is not about John Foster Dulles, but Allen Dulles hates communism as his uncle does, as all of the lawyers representing corporations anywhere on earth. Their biggest hatred is toward the Soviet Union. And that is what this book is about, The Devil's Chessboard, where Allen Dulles becomes eventually the head of another organization, not the OSS, but using all the talent of the spies from World War I. Sorry, I'm getting the two wars mixed up. Let's backtrack. Go back to World War I, when the two brothers are becoming lawyers, and they work for a firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, which has no human clients, only corporations. Their uncle had been Robert Lansing in World War I era, Woodrow Wilson's cabinet, and they were taught to hate communism with all of their blood. And they're going to spill a lot of blood over that issue when they go on into the future, into the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and even the 60s. You have no idea where this book is leading when you begin reading it, because when it opens up, this book is about Nazi Germany, and Allen Dulles, we are being told, is making deals with some of the worst Nazis that ever existed. One of them is Kurt Wolff, who made a deal with Allen. Allen Dulles worked for OSS. All these men who become involved with the CIA later in the Truman era, they've all worked as spies during World War II. And Allen Dulles was situated as a spy in Switzerland, in Bern, Switzerland. And he made deals with a lot of these Nazis. President Roosevelt had warned everybody, no conditional surrender. We're not conditioning, no conditions. You round them up, they give up, and we'll make the conditions. But Allen Dulles knew better than the president, and he defied the orders of President Roosevelt by making deals with Nazis. And the deals that he made, and it's all detailed in this book, it's riveting. The stories are riveting. It's hard to walk away from these stories, and everyone that I've told to read this book cannot put it down because we didn't know. Well, some people knew. I think there are a lot of people who still don't know that we brought a lot of Nazis into our country at the end of World War II. And what David Talbot is doing in this book is showing you the process of the mind, the thinking of men like Alan Dulles, who had been spies during World War II, who hated communism and believed. And if you forget everything I'm telling you, try to remember uh, this one fact, that most of them believed that Hitler, even if they didn't like Hitler, it wouldn't have mattered. They backed him. They were hoping that Hitler, in his bloodthirsty viciousness to conquer the Soviet Union, would finally win, and he would uh, obliterate the Soviet Union, because to them, the Soviet Union was the worst enemy of all, not Hitler. He was bad, but they didn't care about the Jews. I mean, it's pretty obvious in this book. David Talbot, who is not Jewish, by the way, he makes it quite clear that Alan Dulles during the war knew. Oh, there are stories in here that have been documented where German corporate, there was one guy, I forgot his name, but he was the head of a corporation in Germany who found out early in the war or early in the Holocaust history what was happening to the Jews in Auschwitz. And he came to Alan Dulles knowing that he was a spy for the United States and revealed this to him. And Alan Dulles did absolutely nothing, absolutely never sent a memo about it to anyone. He could care less about what Hitler was doing. All they wanted was for Hitler to obliterate the Soviet Union and rid the world of socialism and communism. Why was that? Well, let's think about it. If you're a lawyer like Alan Dulles was for corporate entities back in New York City, and I might not have mentioned the name of the company, it's Sullivan and Cromwell. They're in business still today, and they are the most famous corporate uh, corporate law firm that represented everything from United Fruit, Chase Manhattan, Morgan. I don't know about Morgan, but they represented all the corporations as they still do today. And if there's any foe, any enemy of a corporation, it would be communism. They don't mix. Uh, so Alan Dulles is making deals with some of the worst Nazis of the highest echelons, and he saves many of their necks. It's called Operation Sunrise. The author had access to government documents that you and I could get, just write to the CIA or the FBI and say, you want this document, that document. It's your right as an American citizen. Of course, when you get these documents, they're often blacked out. And if you find a word here or there, you might be lucky, because they still won't tell you everything, won't allow the public to know everything that went on in this operation, that operation, World War I, World War II, what's the difference? The government holds the records and they dole them out as requested. And you as a citizen have every right. You don't have to be a teacher or a special official of any kind. They're your papers, and it's called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. And with those documents, David Talbot wrote this book revealing, although others have written before him, that Alan Dulles knowingly uh, dealt with some of the worst war criminals in the history of the world and allowed them to escape Nuremberg. The trials at Nuremberg that took place in 1946, I guess it was, uh, much of this book is about those trials. As a matter of fact, the book is in three parts. The first part of this Devil's Chessboard is the story of Allen Dulles in Europe during the war, how he deviated from President Roosevelt's orders about unconditional surrenders, and he disobeyed the commander-in-chief because he was in the OSS. This was a spy agency run by Bill Donovan. All of these men who worked for Bill Donovan are going to be part of the new agency that Harry Truman, who becomes president, of course, after Roosevelt dies in April 12th, 1945, Harry becomes the president at the end of the war, and then runs for re-election and becomes president in 1948, right? I got my dates wrong. 48 and is it 48? Well, you remember Harry becomes president on his own and formulates the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the mandate for this agency is outside of the United States, so that we would not have another surprise attack from an enemy, a foreign enemy, ever again. The CIA was formulated for that purpose alone. That's what Harry Truman said. It's only for the purpose of informing the president if the United States has a foreign enemy. The CIA has never been allowed to operate within the borders of the United States, never been allowed to spy on an American citizen. It's only outside. The inside, the internal agency for criminality is, of course, the FBI, run by J. Edgar Hoover for 48 years. But this book is not about J. Edgar Hoover. Millions of books have been written about him, not that many about Allen Dulles. It's not a pretty story. His brother becomes, now at the end of the war, they're both partners in Sullivan and Cromwell. But Eisenhower, at the end of Truman's, Eisenhower comes in 1952, which meant that Harry Truman won the election in 1948. So from 48 to 52, Truman is in charge, and then when Eisenhower comes into power, he elects Allen Dulles, one of the partners of Sullivan and Cromwell, a spy from World War II, who saved many, many Nazis. I'm going to tell you about one of them in a minute. Eisenhower chooses Allen Dulles to be the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he also chooses the brother, John Foster Dulles, to be the Secretary of State. Now think about this. The power now in the hands of one particular family, the Dulles family. John Foster over here with his office in the State Department, running the State Department, and his brother in a secret, a clandestine agency, the CIA. Nobody knows what they're doing. They've got a budget. The Congress gives them money. Go ahead and bring democracy to the rest of the earth. Make sure America remains a democratic nation. And that was the mandate of the CIA, to watch out for any threat to our democracy from foreign nations. It's going to turn out, even to the present day, that the CIA has overturned many democratic elections in many, many countries, especially Asia, South America, Central America, and even in Europe. And very few people know exactly what the CIA was doing because it's a clandestine agency. It doesn't announce its plans. And sometimes when it does announce its plans, it's lying. So this book is about a chessboard of the world that these two men, wielding such enormous power, in the early 50s in the Eisenhower administration, wielding this kind of power as never before until the two Kennedy brothers come into office. These two brothers have the whole world as their chessboard. So what do? Well, before I get to that second part of the book, in which the Dulles brothers are playing chess with the world, let me tell you one of the things that happened during World War II ended. And as I say, Alan Dulles was in sympathy with Nazis. Why? Well, I sort of explained it. It was the hatred of Stalin, the hatred of communism. If you are a top-notch lawyer in a firm that represents corporations who are using small countries, poor countries, as the source of your revenue, then you don't see communism as a good thing for anybody. You don't care about those people in Russia who were starving poor peasants and now finally are going to have something to live for, even though, yes, we know Stalin becomes a terror in himself. Communism doesn't serve the interests of the people because it becomes a totalitarian dictatorship under Stalin, and it's going to end in the late 80s, early 90s. We know that. But in those years after World War II, the hatred for that country was enormous. And it didn't matter that Hitler was murdering Jews or gypsies or homosexuals, because to corporations, communism should not exist. And that was the meaning of their legacy. They went after anybody who wanted to be, they're going to go after anybody who wants to be neutral in the Cold War that's about to come. The Cold War meaning the United States arms race with the Soviet Union. But here, back in the end of World War II, they're saving the necks of all these Nazis, because if I haven't explained this yet, there is no greater hatred in the world than that between Nazis, fascists, and communists. The first thing Hitler did when he took office in 1933 was to get his hands on, round up every communist in Germany, every socialist, people who were sympathetic to socialists. If Joe McCarthy could have done the same thing in America, he would have also murdered every communist. But that's what Hitler did. And the Nazis hated communists, and the feeling was mutual. The communists hated the Nazis. So these two great enemies at the end of World War II were still alive. Hitler was dead. It wasn't supposed to be that way. According to the Dulles plan, Hitler was supposed to be alive at the end of the war, and Stalin was supposed to be dead, because to them, that was the greater threat. And so there was this, to give you some example, it's an important example, that's why I'm going to tell you about it. Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's spy in the Eastern Front, Reinhard Gehlen was alive. He should have gone to Nuremberg and hung with Goering and the rest of those people at Nuremberg, you know, the trial at Nuremberg. Instead, Reinhard Gehlen's neck was saved by Alan Dulles and his friends, and he was installed in the new government of Germany at the beginning of the new era, the 1950s. There was a new government. The Republic of Germany was formulated, and all those Nazis took an oath. I will not love Hitler anymore. I'm no longer a Nazi. Thank you very much. Okay, you're not a Nazi anymore. You took that oath. Now you can go back to your business, to your office, to your profession. No punishment. The people just started life again from taking an oath. Reinhard Gehlen took an oath, therefore he was denazified. And as a denazified Nazi, butcher, he now becomes, thank you very much Alan Dulles. He becomes the head of what is the equivalent of the FBI in the new Germany under Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer was leading the new nation of Germany, hopefully toward a democracy. And Reinhard Gehlen from Hitler's spy agency, he becomes the head of the FBI. It's called something else in Germany, I don't remember, but it's the equivalent of the internal police department of the Republic of Germany. And Reinhard Gehlen hated communists with the same passion, the same hatred that Alan Dulles and the CIA did. And so all of these Nazis who were brought into America by the State Department under John Foster Dulles, under Alan Dulles's help, all thousands of them came to America with false passports, false documents, false names, and Reinhard Gehlen. Now, what would be the reason you would think? To what advantage are any of these Nazis? Why are they bringing them into America? Why are they installing them as investigative people in police departments all over Germany and Europe? Because of their hatred for communism. It was thought by our government at the time that if we had enough Nazis in the country, we would be safe from communism, because the Nazis, supposedly ex-Nazis, they hated Russians and communists, Soviets so much that they would protect our interests. They would protect whose interests? Yours, mine? I don't think so. The interests they were meant to protect were big corporations that needed to make money from small countries, and I'm going to tell you about them now. Because in 1953, as the head of the CIA, Alan Dulles had a problem. He's no longer working for Sullivan and Cromwell, and neither is his brother in the State Department. They're not allowed to have those jobs while they're in government office, but they're still connected in every way to the corporations that they served through that law firm. And so it begins, the story actually begins, the big story begins in 1953 with the nation of Iran. At the end of World War II, every country on this earth worshiped the United States. Well, look what happened. I mean, the world was in ruin. Europe was devastated. Britain was a mess. They lost their empire. The French they had been occupied by the Nazis. Soviet Union lost 29 million people fighting Hitler. The death toll from the Soviet Union's battle in World War II is the biggest ever. 29 million died, keeping Hitler out of their country. As a matter of fact, it's not true that the United States won World War II. Yes, we helped, and we were victorious in our own part, in our own way, but it was because of the Soviet Union that Hitler was dead and that the Nazis could not take over the world. Thanks to the Soviet Union and the dedication, those people over there, they would never give up. They would die fighting, and that's what they did to keep Nazis, fascists out of their country. Well, in Tehran, in Iran, as I'm trying to explain, the world looked up to the United States as a glorious hope for the future. Everybody wanted to be like us. They wanted Elvis Presley, and they wanted Coca-Cola. They wanted rock and roll, and they desperately wanted democracy. So this is an era in which people were made to choose between communism in the East and democracy in the West. The Dulles brothers, in their State Department atmosphere did not want to shake hands with any communists. They hated them to the core of their being. And this is going to develop into policy, foreign policy, that had a terrible effect on your life and my life in the last 70 years, because the Cold War didn't really have to happen. Had Roosevelt not died, we probably would have been friends with the victors of that war. Uh, Whatever you think of Stalin, and he was a murderous dictator, we know that. But Roosevelt had plans to be friends with our allies, but it never got to happen. Harry Truman and Eisenhower changed courses, and they became our great enemy, which is why the Nazis became useful to the CIA. Their thinking was that we'll use the Nazis to deter communism. And so when the Iranians chose to get rid of their Shah and democratically elect a prime minister whose name was Mohammad Mossadegh, he was 73 years old, and he promised to share the wealth of Iran's oil with the starving people of that country. What has been going on, of course, you've heard about the sun never sets on the British Empire. You've heard that before. Well, it was true because the Great Britain owned every country on the planet. Wherever you went, there was Great Britain's colony. Iran had been used for the oil that the British got very cheaply. The company is called British Petroleum, BP, and they were now having a problem because Mohammad Mossadegh, unlike the Shah, was not going to kowtow as a colony of the British anymore. He was going to make his country democratic. And I know you're not going to believe this, but Iran was, at the end of World War II, the greatest democracy that the Middle East had ever known. They had a free press, and they had elections for the first time for a democracy. And it was this man, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was not going to last very long, when Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, on behalf of BP Petroleum, on behalf of the British spies combined with the American spies, they create a subversive operation. It was called Operation Ajax. And they get rid of Mohammad Mossadegh by charging him with communism. They brainwashed the people of Iran with the media into believing that they have elected a communist prime minister, which was not true whatsoever. And Mohammad Mossadegh is put under house arrest, and the Shah of Iran was reinstalled. He was snuck into the palace in a limousine by Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. He was snuck into the palace, and the Iranian people woke up one morning and they had a Shah and no democracy. And for the next 26 years, from 1953 until 79, 53 to 7, well, it's about 26 years, until the Iranian Revolution, in which Ayatollah Khomeini is installed and becomes another dictator, a religious one this time. Iran is a basket case. It is never going to be the same democracy that it tried to be at the end of World War II. In other words, instead of America bringing light and happiness and joy and democracy to the rest of the world, the CIA undermined every attempt in every country. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm only giving you a few examples. Iran is the famous one. That's the one everybody knows about now. But back in the 50s, 60s, until the 1970s, during the Watergate scandal, the Senate Investigating Committee never investigated the CIA. And when they do, in the late 70s, Frank Church, who is a Democratic senator from Idaho, I think it was, Frank Church led the investigative House Select Committee in the Senate to investigate the bygone years of the early years of the formation of the CIA and their covert operations. And this was discovered and outed by the Church Committee. It's called Church Committee because of Frank Church, the senator. And nobody's going to really know about any of these covert operations and the hell that the CIA under the Dulles brothers and their friends brought to small countries around the earth that were the fountains of money for Sullivan and Cromwell clients. The BP, the oil companies were now back in business in Iran, and 26 years, the Shah of Iran did business with outside interests, ignoring the interests of his own people. And they rose up against him in 1979 when the Church Committee revealed what the CIA had done to their democracy. Many Iranians didn't know the story until the Church Committee revealed it, and that caused the 1979 revolution in Iran. So that was in 1953. And Eisenhower knew about all of this. Of course, the president is shielded from any kind of criminality accusation. He's shielded because this is a covert operation by an agency that ran him up, and they can be blamed, and they can, but nobody was ever blamed. Now they're being blamed in books like this. Now everybody knows the story of Iran, or pretty much everybody. Well, next year in 1954, another client of Sullivan and Cromwell had a problem. This time it was in Guatemala. Again, Guatemalans wanted to have a democracy like the United States, the Coca-Cola, the Elvis, they loved the idea of America, the shining light in the world. And they did what Iran did. They held a democratic election. They voted for a man named Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. He had a gorgeous wife, Maria, and two lovely children. And they were highly educated Guatemalans who wanted to bring democracy to the peasants in the mountains of Guatemala. And to do that, they would have to give land to people so they could cultivate it and make a living out of the earth. The trouble was half of Guatemala, a good portion of that country, was owned by United Fruit, a corporation that you may know of called Chiquita Banana. Every time you eat a banana, there's a blue label. It says Chiquita. So many bananas we eat come from Guatemala. That's what Guatemala made a living from. And Jacobo Arbenz was going to give back the money that United Fruit paid for the land. He's going to pay them some money. They'd go away, and Guatemala would keep its land for its own people. Well, you can imagine what Chiquita Banana thought of this idea. And so in 1954, Jacobo Arbenz, Arbenz, you could look him up, was ousted. The story of what happened to this family in the aftermath of that coup d'etat, fomented by the CIA. It didn't take the military of the United States to do this. Just a bunch of people from an agency called the CIA was able to disrupt the lives of millions of people in foreign countries. And the story of what happens to the Arbenz family is horrific. They are not allowed to, the CIA and the State Department made sure that they can never enter any other country. They ran around the world looking for asylum. Their lives were all in danger because of the coup in Guatemala in 1954. Mexico took them in, where the daughter committed suicide, and Guzman himself, Arbenz himself, supposedly committed suicide, but he didn't. He was murdered. So this is a tactic. This is a way of operating that the CIA is very famous for. Now that we know from FOIA documents, and the world didn't really know any of this in the 50s. The next category of operation that's famous, there are all kinds of operations going on covert operations, but this one has to do with our new president. Because when Eisenhower left office, he said to somebody, it's a famous quote from President Eisenhower, that the CIA has left him, his presidency, a legacy of ashes, because all of these operations are failures. Eventually, of course, they all fail. They end up in death, destruction, and nothing good for the people in those suffering nations. They went from dictatorship to another dictatorship when they could have had democracy. And the CIA would not allow any country to have this type of democracy if it meant dealing with Russia as a normal country, or not dealing, refusing to deal with monster corporations of the United States or Great Britain that wanted to plunder whatever the country had worth plundering. In the case of Guatemala, it was bananas. In the case of Iran, it was oil. Well, there's another country going to come up in 1960, the late 50s and 1960. I remember back then because I was in high school, junior high and high school, and I collected stamps. And for stamp collectors back in the 50s and 60s, you went crazy because there were so many new African countries. Every day you woke up and there was a new name. A country changed its name and it broke away from Europe because Europe had colonized every African nation and every Asian nation and Middle Eastern nation. Um, and the Belgian Congo is the next example of this book. It's a horrible example. John F. Kennedy, of course, is going to beat Richard Nixon in that election. Eisenhower leaves office in 60, 52 to 60, he was president. And in 1960, with the help of Joseph P. Kennedy, of course, because it was not a fair election. That's not in this book so much, but I think you've probably heard that Nixon actually won in 1960 and nobody challenged it. And thanks to John P. Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy, the bootlegging father, ambassador to England, who was in with the unions and the mob in Chicago, they helped John Kennedy become president. And it sounds plausible to me, especially since they were Catholic. No president could ever be Catholic in our country. It was we'd never had a Catholic president ever. Al Smith had tried to in 1928, but Americans were scared out of voting for Catholics because they thought the Vatican was going to run America if we had a Catholic president. That's a whole other story, and he doesn't dwell on that in the book. I'm only mentioning it. But John F. Kennedy becomes president in 1960. Now, when he campaigned in 59, when he was campaigning for the presidency, John Kennedy, he was very young, very handsome, very rich, but he believed in African nationalism. He made speeches in Harlem and all over his campaign. He agreed with the rising tide of African nations disconnecting themselves from their colonists, their imperialist mentors, so to speak. You know, Great Britain, France, they had been ruling over these poor nations, and now they were going to be free. Kennedy pledged to help the Belgian Congo, to help Patrice Lumumba. That was the fellow who had been simply a postal worker. When the Belgians decided they've had enough, well, the Congolese were killing white people. King Leopold in the 19th century literally owned a country, personally owned a whole country. It came to be called the Belgian Congo when he died. The king died and the Belgian government took over, and they were not doing any welfare for the Congolese people. They were not building schools, they were not building hospitals. And anyway, the Congolese got tired and they were inspired by democracy in the end of World War II. So out go the Belgians, and in comes a man called Patrice Lumumba. And Patrice Lumumba was no communist, he was no socialist, he was a really beloved. Um, I guess he was the president. That's what his title was. But the CIA hated him. Alan Dulles hated Patrice Lumumba because he refused to deny doing business with the Soviet Union. And as I explained, any country, any leader of any country who wanted to be neutral, who wanted to do business both with the Soviet Union and the United States, because let's remember, the world, maybe Americans are dumb in thinking we won the war. Americans have been fed this nonsense. I was fed this nonsense that America saved the world from Hitler. It's not true. And the world knew that. Everyone outside of America, all these other countries on earth knew the Soviet Union sacrifice of 29 million people. Everyone knew that except us. It was never in our history books because of the fear of communism, and that's what the Soviet Union represented, a great fear to our corporate interests, and our democracy was threatened by communism. The truth was, actually, I'll tell you what the truth was. Lenin and Trotsky, in their original revolution in 1917, their idea was to spread communism throughout the planet. They believed in international spreading of their ideas, and they would never stop at trying to influence Germany. Might have gone communist after the revolution in Russia. Germany, Italy, France, they would all eventually become communist countries, according to the Soviet Lenin and Trotsky. But when Stalin took over from them, he changed everything. Most people don't know this, so I'm trying to explain that Stalin believed that communism should remain in the Soviet Union, and he had no interest whatsoever in spreading the idea of communism throughout the world. He was completely 180-degree different from the original thinking of the original revolutionaries. So this fear of communism was outrageous and beyond the beyonds. And so the Belgian Congo was next on the list to be dismantled, or Patrice Lumumba is going to be murdered in a very violent and barbaric way. The CIA is responsible for getting the enemies of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo to murder him. But here's the thing about Kennedy, and half the book is about Kennedy. When he campaigned for the presidency, he came to Harlem and he made speeches about this is hallowed ground. Harlem is revolutionary ground. This is where the African nations are going to rise up, and I, as president, am going to help them get rid of imperialism in their countries. I'm going to help Patrice Lumumba. Now, why did he say this in Harlem about hallowed ground, revolutionary ground in Harlem? Because President Kennedy was making these speeches at the Hotel Teresa. Some of you may remember that this is where Fidel Castro, who in the 50s was a great hero, Che Guevara and Fidel Castro came to New York City. They were giving speeches at the United Nations because they were the world-class heroes of the day. They had come down from the mountains of Cuba and they rid their nation of criminality under Batista regime. And there was going to be a new day in Cuba of democracy, and they were great heroes. But the problem was that Castro had socialist ideas. He was friendly with the Soviets. And so in New York City, no hotel would take them in for less than $7 million, whatever. They were purposely racking up the charge of a hotel to keep Fidel Castro out and his entourage out. So they had nowhere to stay. Um, this is in the late 50s, and they had nowhere to stay. But a black man in Harlem who managed the Teresa Hotel, he said, "This is a disgrace. What I'm black and I'm from the South. I know what it feels like to be thrown out of a hotel or not allowed in. So, Mr. Castro, Mr. Guevara, you come to my Hotel Teresa and I won't charge you hardly any money." And that's what happened. The whole entourage of the Cuban Revolution ends up in the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, which at that time was a black neighborhood. And every diplomat from the United Nations, including Khrushchev, came to the hotel to shake Fidel Castro's hand. And that's why Kennedy, when he campaigned for president in 1960, he came to Harlem and he said, "I'm going to help black nationalism in Africa. I'm going to help people from these small countries have a life and have a democracy like we have in America." This is exactly what the world was hoping for. Kennedy, when he becomes the president, was beloved everywhere on earth. He was going to be the Camelot of the world. He was bringing knighthood to the planet, and everyone loved him. Oh, yeah. So there's a picture in this book that, President Kennedy had a photographer, sat around the White House taking pictures of whatever was going on. And he gets a phone call. I forget what year. It's only in 1961 in February. He's only been the president 1 or 2 months. And he's now gotten a phone call. And here is the photograph of Kennedy. See, that's the photograph. It's not nice to look at because we know, well, first of all, if you look at this photo, you think, oh my God, this man just got a call saying his mother is dead, his children are dead. Why is he in so much pain? What is it about this phone call? Who's telling him something on the other end that makes him look like he's in anguish? It was Adlai Stevenson on the other end from the United Nations. He had been the ambassador at the time. Adlai Stevenson is telling President Kennedy that this man, Patrice Lumumba, had been brutally murdered by his enemies on behalf of the CIA. Kennedy had pledged in his campaign to help Patrice Lumumba, and the CIA, under Allen Dulles, made sure that Patrice Lumumba was murdered before Kennedy took office. And Kennedy is now being told that Lumumba was murdered a month ago, and there's no help he can give the Congo because the enemies, the fascist enemies, are now being supported by the CIA, covertly supported. Anyway, that was a big shock to President Kennedy, and there are going to be many, many more shocks for him to come, especially in the arms race, and especially, and that's where this book really takes off. I didn't tell you that the love life of Allen Dulles is in this book. His wife, Clover, goes nuts. She needs a psychiatrist, and Allen Dulles has many, many lovers, many mistresses. And his wife in Long Island doesn't know where her husband is and who he's with, but she becomes familiar with one of his mistresses. So there is sex in this book, a lot of it. Not graphic sex, but the stories of Dulles with his mistresses and his wife. They end up going to the same psychiatrist. His name was Carl Jung in Switzerland. Clover and Mary, the mistress, become friends with one another. So that makes the book very interesting. They become friends. And by the way, how does David Talbot know any of this? Well, Allen Dulles' daughter is in her 90s, living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, driving a Prius car with a bumper sticker that says "Vote for President, vote for Obama." Uh, and David Talbot got most of this juicy family intrigue from the daughter Joan, who's an Obama supporter. Alan Dulles would be turning over in his grave that any child of his would be a Democrat in the first place, or vote for a black man named Obama would be too shocking. Speaking of death, John Foster Dulles dies just about the time that Kennedy becomes president. And when he dies as Secretary of State, the world honors him without ever knowing his criminal deeds as Secretary of State. He was a criminal. He should have gone to jail. But he died without anybody knowing this, and the lines for his funeral were around the block, and everybody honored him. But by the time his younger brother passes away in the late 60s, Alan Dulles and his crimes are going to be pretty much known. Not as much as we know today, because today he'd be in jail, maybe even executed for treason, who knows. But people of this level never go to jail. So who knows if I'm just saying they'd go to jail, but they probably wouldn't, because did you ever know someone as big as that went to jail? Even Richard Nixon escaped jail by being pardoned and resigning from the presidency. He wouldn't have gone to jail either. It just doesn't happen where men of that stature in office ever are punished by incarceration. It just doesn't happen. But they were criminals. The things they did were against the Constitution of the United States. They disobeyed the commander in chief over and over and over again. And now comes the big one. It's called the Bay of Pigs. And the Cuban exiles living here in Miami and Florida and New York, they were angry about Fidel Castro. We understand that. But the idea was to get rid of him by invading. Now, this whole thing about the Bay of Pigs invasion is really not what it's cracked up to be. The problem, as detailed in this book, based on FOIA documents, is that Alan Dulles and there were hundreds of people like Alan Dulles in the CIA. They all thought the same way from World War II, that the greatest threat to the world was communism and the Soviet Union. And since Cuba was now communist, they were going to entrap a president who didn't have the stomach. He didn't have the stomach for World War III. And it is true that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were biting to go cause another, they were chomping at the bit to cause another war, because as I explained, World War II didn't end correctly. For those men, it ended wrong. Hitler was not supposed to be dead. It was Stalin and the Soviets who were supposed to be dead. And now, because the United States helped the Soviet Union survive in that war, the greatest threat to their corporations and their power was the Soviet Union. So now they're going to operate on Cuba. And so the Bay of Pigs invasion, according to David Talbot and the documents he looked at, Alan Dulles and his friends there knew that it would fail. You can't take a couple of hundred or even 1,000 men, give them guns and send them into a country and take over a country. You can't easily do this. Not in Fidel Castro's Cuba, no. And it's not going to work, and they knew it would fail. But here's the glitch. They knew it would fail. The men who were doing it didn't know it was going to fail. They were just fodder. If you look at it the way David Talbot is explaining it, and he's not the only one who's explaining it this way. If you look at it this way, the fellows who were invading their former country to take it back, they had no idea that they were going to be shot dead, left on a beach. They were just abandoned. They had no idea. They thought that the CIA really meant to keep them successful. But the truth is, Kennedy did not want to fight with Russia. He did not want. He didn't even want the arms race to go on the way it was going, because when he found out how many people could die from thermonuclear, let's remember, during the Eisenhower administration, the previous one before Kennedy, there was a big battle going on over the bomb. Um, this is a whole other story. I don't want to distract you, but there was now a new bomb. It was no longer an atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was necessary only for one purpose now, to ignite a hydrogen bomb, which was 1,000 times bigger than the atomic bomb. And that happened in the early 50s. There was a battle in the United States over whether or not science was going to, whether or not the government was going to create a hydrogen thermonuclear bomb, which is 1,000 times bigger than the ones dropped on Japan. And in order to detonate a hydrogen bomb, you have to use an atomic bomb. So Kennedy had no stomach for this. It's documented everywhere in his administration, in the papers. He could not believe the possibilities of world devastation, human beings gone from this earth. He had no stomach for it. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff were very, very insistent on getting the Soviet Union to their knees. Kennedy realized a lot of things that he didn't understand before he was the president. Like there was no missile gap. You know, Eisenhower knew this, but he couldn't say why he knew it. There was a missile gap, actually. We were the ones with all the missiles, and the Soviets had a handful of them. But it was portrayed as the opposite, to scare the people to vote for John Kennedy, because he thought there was a missile gap in the other direction. When he becomes president, he finds out the Russians have nothing and we've got everything. And why should we go on making more weapons? And why devastate the earth with threats? Why should we threaten another war? We can't do that. And he was trying to limit the arms race. And what's going to happen with the Bay of Pigs is very, very important, because the dullest people think that Kennedy is going to call in the Marines when these American soldiers, they're not part of the army. They're a paramilitary trained by the CIA. And they're all going to, not all of them, but many of them die on the beach in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and they expect the president to call in the Marines. Well, you know, because we're still alive. Perhaps if the Marines had been called, the Soviets would have run to the aid of the Cubans, and World War III, well, I don't know. And that's what didn't happen, thank goodness, because President Kennedy said no to the CIA. He said no to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I forget his name. I always forget his name. The guy from SAC, Strategic Command. He wanted President Kennedy to nuke Cuba during this time of crisis, because after the Bay of Pigs failed, and every Cuban in Miami turned to the Republican Party and never again voted for a Democrat, because Kennedy refused to call in the Marines to invade Cuba. Kennedy knew if he invaded Cuba, the Soviets would be right behind with their nuclear weapons. And that's what's going to happen in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that is when Kennedy and Khrushchev and Castro embark on a secret, they were secretly communicating with each other. Unbeknownst, in the case of Khrushchev and Kennedy, their armed forces, the leaders of their armed forces, their military people didn't know that Khrushchev and Kennedy were secretly colluding on a method to back off from the dangers that were growing in the world because of the nuclear arms race. They did try, but it's not going to work. And the reason it doesn't work is because Kennedy is murdered. He's, he's murdered 6 months after he gives a speech at the university, American University in Virginia. Anybody can watch this speech and bring a box of tissues because you'll cry. You weren't expected to cry when he gave it, but knowing that he's giving this speech to an audience of scholars at the American University, knowing that in 6 months, from June of 1963, was it? In 6 months, he'll be dead, murdered by the CIA. Yes, that's what this book is telling us. And it's not the only author, the only book. People now are understanding much more about Kennedy's assassination in light of his refusal to nuke Cuba, his refusal to go against Cuba and the Soviet Union, and to coordinate secretly with them a backing off of the dangers to life on this planet that was being brought about by all the nukes being developed and all the money that's going in. I mean, let's not forget, when President Eisenhower left the office to give it up to Kennedy, he made a farewell address, and everybody knows what he said because it's famous. He said the greatest threat, and he did this on television, farewell address. He said the greatest threat to the future of our country is the connection between industry and Wall Street. He had a word for this. He called it the military industrial complex. But he was referring to the connections between corporate interests on Wall Street, banks, corporations making armaments, industry, Wall Street getting together with the Congress and colluding to conspiring to make gazillions of money, gazillions of dollars against the interests of world peace, and certainly against the interests of peace in the United States. That was this famous farewell speech. You could watch it on YouTube. Just put in military industrial complex or put in Eisenhower farewell. You can watch the entire speech, and it's very moving because we know what comes later. Kennedy becomes president. He doesn't stay in office long enough to change the world, although he is trying in secretive ways. And so this book analyzes the background of why Kennedy was murdered, because he was ordering the soldiers out of Vietnam. That's an issue. This book has everything in it. The history of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the love affairs of Allen Dulles and the traitorous behavior of members of the CIA, disobeying President Roosevelt, disobeying Truman. Let's not, well, you probably don't know this, but right after Kennedy was murdered, I think it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, President Truman, who was still alive at the time, wrote an editorial that the Washington Post put on page 11 in the back of the newspaper. It was supposed to be in the front of the paper, but Allen Dulles persuaded the newspaper to put it all the way deep in the back. So many people never read it, but I have a copy and you can get a copy. It's out there. President Truman wrote an editorial condemning the CIA, not for the murder of John F. Kennedy, although that's the connection you would make if you were reading this 2 weeks after Kennedy was murdered. The ex-president is saying, well, I made the CIA, I put it into existence, but I didn't expect them to run amok. They're not a private agency. I made them to be responsible to give information to the president, and that's all they were supposed to do. What is Truman saying in this coded, it's a coded language that he's speaking in this editorial, and anybody who looks back at it now has to say, oh my God, Truman realized the CIA had killed the president because he was disobeying their ideas of a world free of communism. Free for what? Why? millions of Russians wanted communism. Millions of people all over the earth did believe in communism and thought, well, maybe that'll be a good idea. But the CIA wouldn't let them find out. They were in control of everything. And this is going to go on and on, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, to this very moment. The CIA operates in ways I'm not sure we understand or will never really know the truth. That's why the book is exciting to read, because it's a detective story. It's a historical account of things you don't read about in the newspaper. If you do, it's not told in accurate detail usually. So the book is showing how Kennedy was, oh, the Bay of Pigs failed. Kennedy did not send in the Marines, and 6 months later, he fired Allen Dulles and fired all the other men who developed the Bay of Pigs operation. They were all fired, but they didn't go away. They stayed together in Georgetown at Allen Dulles's townhouse, and they had meetings. And that is why most people who observe or who read about this and look at the documents that we have available, that the CIA under Dulles was still in operation, even though Kennedy had fired him. They were going to get, and the deputy, the other thing that made me realize this must be true is Allen Dulles's deputy was named, I forget his first name, George Cabell, Cabell. Maybe it wasn't George, but Cabell is his name. And he was the instigator of the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. And he was personally fired also by Kennedy. Well, the mayor of Dallas, Texas, was his brother, Elmer or Eugene Cabell. There were two brothers, Cabell. One was the mayor of Dallas, Texas, and the other was the guy that developed the Bay of Pigs invasion for Allen Dulles. And of course, when Kennedy was told not to go to Dulles, Adlai Stevenson, I think, was the one, they spit on him. The people hated the Democrats in Dallas, Texas, and it was not a comfortable place for a Democratic politician to go. But Kennedy went with an open car in an entourage. And here is the interesting fact that I'll never forget from this book. That morning in Dallas, Texas, on the front page of every newspaper was the map of the entourage that was going to go from the airport in Dallas straight to, I guess, Town Hall, to the center of the city. And it was a straight route. It was from the airport, and Main Street was just straight. That was the map outlined on the cover, on the front page of every newspaper. So if you lived in Dallas, you knew which way the entourage was going to travel with President Kennedy in the car. Well, it wasn't a straight line, because I think you remember there's something called Dealey Plaza, and the entire entourage was diverted at the last minute. Now, you're the mayor of this city. Your brother is the CIA guy that got fired by the man in that limousine, who loves commies, who loves communism. And you're the mayor of this town. You don't know that they're going to change the entourage to go around a circle that slows down the limousine to 5 miles an hour. Had they gone the way of the map published in the newspaper, it would have been a straight 15 miles an hour, something as slow as that, 15 miles an hour. And it would have gone straight down Main Street. But it was diverted to go around a circle, making the limousine slow to 5 miles an hour, making it much easier to shoot the president in the head. And he was dead. Johnson is the president. And even before Kennedy was buried, I don't even think they did the autopsy yet. When Johnson went into the White House and ordered all the soldiers back into Vietnam, Kennedy was not yet buried. I'm not even sure that Oswald was captured yet. The new president, uh, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, there are many theories that Johnson concocted the assassination. No, he must have known what was about to happen. He probably did. And he did the bidding of the CIA. He did the bidding of the shadow government that would not allow friendship with the country that saved the world from Adolf Hitler. And so the rest is history. The Vietnam War went on. 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. We sent 500,000 kids in there. 300,000 came back without arms, without legs, without mental capacity, and 58,000, more than 10% of our armed forces in Vietnam were slaughtered. And we don't know how many millions of Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians were slaughtered in the Vietnam War. So that's it for the Devil's Chessboard. It's a new take that you may not have heard of. It's a fascinating story of our country's covert history in the shadows. I hope it's going to be a better future. And I hope we're all well and that we can talk about more books. I wish I was with you so you could ask a million questions. Read it yourself. It's a bestseller from 5 years ago. It was published 5 years ago. The Devil's Chessboard, David Talbot. Talbot. Bye, everybody. Take care. Be well.